Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 166. Not as good as the fish in the Black Lake. The Quidditch frenzy at Hogwarts showed no sign of waning. The library's Quidditch books were all checked out, with a waitlist stretching until after Christmas. "If I'd known, I would have come sooner," Harry muttered in frustration as he stood at the second-floor library entrance. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m. was his special training session, and he'd hoped to study up beforehand. But Madame Pants, the librarian, informed him there were no more Quidditch books available and that he'd need to wait until after the holidays. "Nothing we can do about it," Ron said with a shrug. "Quidditch is all anyone's talking about right now. If you're clueless about it, people will make fun of you." He grinned, feeling proud. His own popularity had soared recently, thanks to his Quidditch knowledge and his two brothers on the Gryffindor team. Everywhere he went, younger students flocked to him for his insights, a new, exhilarating experience. "What if we ask Hermione?" Harry suggested cautiously. "She borrowed Quidditch through the ages once, maybe she hasn't returned it yet." At the mention of Hermione, Ron's grin instantly faded. His face fell, and he frowned. "I don't think so, Harry. She hasn't said a word to us since that day we came back from the 4th floor. And everyone knows Hermione never keeps a library book for more than 3 days." Harry remembered now, Hermione was indeed that way. Since the start of term, she always carried 2 books, her class textbook and one borrowed from the library. She wasn't one to just lug books around, she read them too. She rarely socialized in the common room, often sitting alone in a corner with her nose in a book. Somehow, it had become common knowledge in Gryffindor that she exchanged her library books every 3 days. Seamus Finnegan had even bet the two of them that she wouldn't keep it up for a month. Judging by things now, though, he was likely to lose that bet. If she borrowed another book tomorrow, Seamus would owe everyone in the dorm a box of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. Harry didn't mind the sweets, but he couldn't quite grasp how Hermione managed to finish a book in only 2 or 3 days. For him, even finishing one in 2 weeks felt like a struggle. "Forget it," Harry sighed. He didn't really want to face Hermione, either. The quiet authority of her academic reputation always made him uneasy. "Why not ask Kyle?" Ron suggested suddenly. "I heard Fred and George mention he has a collection of Quidditch books, more than one, even." Harry was intrigued but hesitant. "But I don't know Kyle. Do you think he'd actually lend me a book?" "Don't worry, I'll handle it," Ron assured him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Taking Harry's arm, he started down the stairs. "You won't know unless you try. Come on, let's go find him." The two of them searched every corner of the castle, from the underground classrooms to the astronomy tower, but Kyle was nowhere to be found. Even the twins and Cedric seemed to have vanished. Finally, while scanning the astronomy tower, Harry glanced out the window and spotted the group down by the Black Lake, fishing. "So, you're looking to borrow a Quidditch book?" Kyle asked, glancing at the panting pair who'd just arrived by the Black Lake. "Isn't there one in the library? Their collection's way more extensive than mine. You could just borrow it there." "It's already been borrowed," Harry replied, catching his breath and feeling a bit nervous. Madame Pants said nothing would be available until after Christmas. On the way over, Ron had offered to do the asking, but Harry thought it best to make the request himself. After all, he was the one who needed the book, not Ron. "Quidditch books are that popular these days?" Kyle said, noting Harry's anxious expression. Without another word, he took out his wand and cast, Accio Book of Quidditch Origins. In moments, a hefty book flew through the air, landing lightly in Kyle's hand. "Here, you can start with this one," Kyle said, holding out the book. "It has some flying instructions included, better suited for someone new, like you." "Thanks," Harry said gratefully, taking the book. "I'll bring it back as soon as I can." Kyle waved him off. No rush. I don't need it at the moment, so take your time. After thanking Kyle again, Harry and Ron headed back to the castle. As they walked away, Kyle turned to Fred and George, who were sitting beside him, looking unusually subdued. "What's up with you two?" When Ron greeted them earlier, the twins hadn't even turned around, something uncharacteristic for them. Although they loved teasing Ron, they'd never outright ignored him. At the very least, they'd usually give him some kind of response. "It's nothing. We just don't feel like talking to him," Fred replied with a sigh. "We always thought Ron was a bit dense, but we didn't think he was this dense," George added, shaking his head. "What do you mean?" Kyle raised an eyebrow, sensing there might be a story behind this. "Remember the last time we ran into them on the 4th floor?" George asked. Kyle nodded. He did remember. He'd even seen them there himself. "Well, we asked around," Fred said. "Turns out they went there because they'd agreed to a wizard's duel with Malfoy." "A wizard's duel?" Cedric, who'd been listening, looked surprised. "Slytherins don't throw those around lightly." "Sounds like a trap." "Exactly." George sighed. "Curfew time, on the 4th floor where they're bound to be spotted, a wizard's duel. Add it all up, and even a garden gnome would see it's a setup." But Ron actually fell for it. Fred shook his head. "Merlin, is he even a real Weasley?" Cedric opened his mouth, as though to say something in Ron's defense, but no words came out. With Charlie, Percy, and the twins all being clever in their own ways, Ron did look rather dim by comparison. "He takes the bait like it's nothing," Fred said, waving his hand dismissively. "Honestly, he's not even as sharp as the fish in the Black Lake." Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 167, Hogwarts' Darkest Hour. Fred and George didn't truly dislike Ron, they were just exasperated. If they genuinely didn't care, they wouldn't have gone on about him like this. "You can't put it that way," Kyle said thoughtfully. "At least Ron is honest. That's a virtue." "But why'd they end up dueling Malfoy in the first place?" "It was apparently over that first year, Neville," Fred explained. "Malfoy hid Neville's remembrall and mocked him for having a terrible memory. Ron and Harry stood up for him, which led to the challenge, a 3-on-3 wizard duel. Who comes up with that? Having a sense of justice and loyalty, those are 2 more points in his favor," Kyle nodded, genuinely. "So, Ron isn't as bad as you're making him out to be. At least he's got more to him than the fish in the Black Lake. We're not criticizing his intentions." Fred shook his head, smiling a bit ruefully. "If he'd acted out of cowardice or shame, we wouldn't care. We're just questioning his common sense. I mean, even complaining to Professor McGonagall would have been smarter than sneaking to the 4th floor after hours." George sighed. "And after all that, he just slept it off and let it go." Kyle raised an eyebrow, seeming to pick up on their underlying frustration. "After all, the rivalry between Gryffindor and Slytherin ran deep, and if Slytherins pulled a dirty trick, you didn't just drop it, you at least returned the favor. Now, if it had been me," George went on, "I'd have 5 ways to make Malfoy regret it. Like arranging for an owl to deliver a dung bomb at breakfast that'd explode the moment he opened it," Fred suggested. "Or slipping the contents of a failed potion into his shoes," George added, eyes glinting. "That might be tricky," Kyle observed, rubbing his chin. "Snape usually disposes of the failed potions himself. But if you're willing to risk losing points and detention, you could try causing an accident in potions." Fred and George looked at Kyle in surprise. "Cause an accident in Snape's class?" Even if it looked accidental, Snape would dock at least 100 points, and that was on a good day. Kyle must have been mad to think they'd go that far. Gryffindor might come last in the House Cup every year at this rate, which was a humiliation they weren't eager to live down. Rolling their eyes, Fred and George decided to ignore Kyle's suggestion. "We've come up with something better," George said, exchanging a mischievous glance with Fred. "To increase Ron's sense of caution. And ensure he doesn't fall for such a flimsy trap again. We've decided to put him through some special training. Special training? Cedric asked, looking puzzled. But this isn't Quidditch. How do you train for something like this? We call it the darkest hour at Hogwarts, Fred replied with a wicked grin. We stayed up all night perfecting it. But it's all for Ron's own good, he's still our favorite little brother, George added. Of course, it might cause him a little pain, Fred said, feigning innocence. But he'll be better for it in the end. At the very least, we know our limits and won't do any real damage, George assured. In the future, he'll definitely thank us, Fred concluded. Kyle wasn't sure if future Ron would thank Fred and George, but he knew that Ron's days were about to get a lot rougher. The darkest hour at Hogwarts, the name alone sounded ominous. Though Kyle had no idea what the plan entailed, he knew it wouldn't be pleasant. Poor Ron, two unpredictable brothers were more than enough to handle. Need any help with it? Kyle asked, a little intrigued. Not yet, Fred replied, shaking his head. The plan's perfect already, we'll start tomorrow. Kyle nodded, slightly disappointed. All right, but let me know if anything comes up. Don't worry, we'll go all out when the time comes, George assured him. Just then, Kyle felt a sudden, powerful tug on his fishing rod, so strong it nearly yanked him into the black lake. Crack! The rod snapped in half with a sharp sound. Kyle forgot all about the Weasley twins and immediately gripped the remaining half of his fishing rod, pulling back with all his might. Quick, Cedric, reinforce it. The fishing rod they'd been using was makeshift, cobbled together from rowan branches and spider silk, so this kind of breakage was inevitable if they hooked a particularly big catch. I'm coming, just hang on. Cedric shouted, tossing aside his own rod to help. But before he could draw his wand, Kyle stumbled back as his rod jerked sharply, flinging a silvery white fish onto the grass nearby. Ignoring the grass and leaves stuck to him, Kyle jumped up and ran over. The fish was about a foot long, weighing roughly 2 pounds, a wide-backed catfish, typical of the Black Lake. Kyle frowned. The wide-backed catfish in the lake were usually smaller, so 2 pounds was considered sizable. Yet the tug he'd felt was far too strong for a fish this size to cause. Rowanwood wasn't especially strong, but even so, a 2-pound fish shouldn't have snapped it clean in two. That's odd. Nearby, Cedric, who'd crouched to inspect the fish, pointed at its belly. Kyle, look at this. Kyle leaned over and froze. The fish didn't have a hook in its mouth, instead, it was tied up. The thin, spidery fishing line had wrapped around it twice, tied neatly in a bow. Kyle. Fred asked uncertainly, does your fishing rod have some charm that ties knots by itself? Of course not. Kyle snapped, exasperated. It was just a casual fishing setup, who would go to such trouble as to enchant it to tie knots automatically? Besides, he'd never even heard of such magic. Seeing the fish tied up so securely, Kyle had a pretty good idea of what might have happened. The giant squid in the Black Lake, or maybe the Mere People. Someone, probably one of them, had taken the time to tie this wide-backed catfish to the fishing line and send it back. As if on cue, the others' fishing rods began to tug. When they pulled them up, each one had a neatly tied wide-backed catfish on the end. Kyle's face darkened. Really? They'd spent over an hour with no luck, only to have their catch handed to them like this. Sending fish up as a joke felt like a bit much. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 168, 1,000 sheets of parchment. Since joining the Quidditch team, Kyle's schedule had become a constant juggle. Days were packed with classes, library sessions, nighttime ventures into the restricted section to copy notes, and squeezing in assignments, which seemed to have doubled in length this year. Professors had apparently conspired to change their paper requirements from inches to feet just last week. To top it off, Quidditch training consumed 3 evenings each week, with Harris keeping everyone on the pitch for at least 3 hours per session, often until curfew. But the intense regimen had its benefits. After just a few practices, Kyle and his teammates were noticeably more in sync. Today, He and Harris had successfully executed the two-way attack, a classic maneuver adapted from the Vimborn Wasp's Eagle's Head formation. They'd fly together toward the center goalpost, passing the quaffle back and forth before splitting at the scoring zone to throw off the keeper. In their latest match, Kyle and Harris managed to score a total of 60 goals, leaving Hufflepuff's keeper, Farrell, thoroughly overwhelmed. The poor boy had to be carried back to the dorm by his teammates, his eyes glazed over. "Cheer up, Farrell," Harris encouraged, hauling Farrell's right leg, his face flushed with enthusiasm. "You're one of the best keepers in school. If you're struggling, no one else has a chance either. We're going to have our name on the Quidditch Cup again this year, I'm telling you. Why do I already want the tournament to start, and it's not even November yet?" He laughed as they trooped back into the castle, with Kyle bringing up the rear on his broomstick. Just as they passed the Great Hall, they crossed paths with Fred and George, who were descending the stairs with pockets suspiciously full. When Harris and the rest had gone, Cedric raised an eyebrow, grinning as he asked, almost curfew, "Is this a little nighttime stroll, or?" "Nope, just back from Hogsmeade and heading to the kitchens for a midnight snack," George said, patting his stuffed pockets with a sly grin. "Zonko's latest, grabbed them just before closing. All for our dear little brother," Fred added with a wink, tossing a leather pouch to Kyle. "Here's what you asked for." "Thanks," Kyle said, taking the bag. Fred's eyes lit up with curiosity as he looked at Kyle. "Any fresh money-making schemes in the works? If so, don't hold back." "What?" Kyle blinked, caught off guard. He'd barely had a minute to think about anything beyond Quidditch and homework lately, let alone concoct new business ideas. "Don't play coy, what are you hiding from us?" George grumbled. "If you didn't have some new idea, then why'd you order so much parchment?" "Yeah, don't tell us it's for making maps." "The map-selling craze ended almost a month ago," Fred said, slinging an arm around Kyle's shoulders with an expression that clearly said, "You can't fool me. If you didn't have a new scheme, there's no way you'd buy 1,000 sheets of parchment." 1,000 sheets? "That's practically the entire stock," George said. "We almost couldn't get it all." "Almost not enough?" Kyle repeated, glancing into his moleskin pouch, where he could see a thick stack of parchment, though it was hard to tell how many sheets there were. "Yup, 1,063 sheets," Fred said with a smirk. "The extras were a bonus. We even got the scribes to close shop 20 minutes early to make it happen. So, come on, tell us what this plan is." Fred stroked his chin thoughtfully, speculating. "If it's parchment, it's probably not a map. Or are you planning to start charging for homework answers?" "Neither," Kyle replied, shaking his head. "Honestly, it's just for me." "Come off it," George said, rolling his eyes. 1,000 sheets of parchment just for homework? Cedric, could you even use that much in a whole semester?" Cedric shook his head. To be honest, 1,000 sheets would probably last him through all 7 years at Hogwarts. "I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true," Kyle insisted. "I've just been copying a lot lately and need the extra parchment, that's all." Seeing the sincerity in Kyle's expression, Fred and George's persistence began to wane. "Are you absolutely sure?" George asked, still skeptical. "Absolutely," Kyle shrugged. "And if I'm lying, Cedric here will start losing his hair from this year on." "Hey! What's that got to do with me?" Cedric protested, scowling at Kyle. "Oh, don't be petty," Kyle said with a smirk. "Don't you trust me?" "That's not the point," Cedric muttered, looking uncomfortable. His father had always struggled with hair loss, and he certainly didn't want to share that fate. At that, Fred and George finally let go of their suspicions. They exchanged glances, a bit deflated. With a sense of disappointment hanging over them, they turned and headed back toward Gryffindor Tower. All along the way, they'd been hyped, imagining all sorts of grand plans Kyle might be cooking up, only to discover there was none. The letdown stung. "Oi, you're going the wrong way," Cedric called after them. The kitchens are downstairs. Thanks, Fred said glumly, but suddenly, we're not that hungry anymore. And we don't feel like eating, George added with a sigh. After the twins left, Cedric ran a hand through his hair, frowning. What's gotten into them? Kyle shrugged. Who knows, maybe it's puberty. What? Nothing, Kyle replied quickly. Anyway, curfew's coming up, let's head back. Right. Late that night, once his roommates were fast asleep, Kyle quietly got out of bed, slipped out of the dormitory, and made his way to the library for his usual late-night visit. Navigating straight to the third bookcase in the restricted section, he opened his leather bag, pulled out a quill and a fresh stack of parchment, and laid them on the nearest table. Lumos, he whispered, lighting the tip of his wand. Then, after selecting a book with careful precision, he took a seat and began flipping through the pages. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 169, Fortified Pumpkin. This hectic pace continued until the eve of Halloween. That morning, Kyle woke up to the sweet, mouth-watering aroma of roasted pumpkin wafting through the hallways. Even better, Harris announced in the common room that there would be no Quidditch practice for the following week. He admitted the recent training sessions had been a bit intense, and with Kyle and the other new players' impressive performances, he decided to give the team a breather before the official matches began. Kyle was thrilled with this unexpected break, grateful for the chance to relax a bit. To his delight, in honor of Halloween, the school seemed filled with extra pumpkins. Several new ones were scattered across the classrooms. During Transfiguration class that morning, Professor McGonagall used pumpkins as teaching props, instructing the students to transfigure them into anything they liked, as long as the end result was no longer a pumpkin. Kyle was, as usual, the first to complete the task, transforming his pumpkin into a miniature replica of the stone statue guarding the castle entrance. The tiny statue took 2 steps across his desk and then swung its oversized sword in a wide arc, unintentionally smashing Kanna's pumpkin nearby, scattering pumpkin seeds all over her desk, and her face. Kanna, clearly unamused, wiped the seeds off her face and shot Kyle a furious glare, her teeth clenched in frustration as if she might pounce and take a chunk out of him. Oops. That was an accident. Kyle hurriedly apologized, realizing he'd forgotten the sword was merely a conjured illusion. Professor McGonagall, whose rare smile hinted at mild amusement, said, "Hufflepuff loses 1 point for your ungentlemanly behavior. A bit of recklessness there, and it could have been dangerous." "Understood, Professor," Kyle muttered sheepishly. She nodded approvingly at his lifelike stone statue. "Very well, Hufflepuff, 11 points for excellent transfiguration." Since there were no specific requirements for the transfiguration, the exercise was simpler than usual, and most students completed it successfully. By the end of class, the transfiguration room had turned into a bizarre storage area, filled with everything from stakes and buckets to pillows and lamps. Among those who partially succeeded, some students' transformations still showed hints of their pumpkin origins. Ryan, for instance, had reshaped his pumpkin into a quaffle, but the quaffle remained bright yellow, with the unmistakable texture of pumpkin skin. Despite this, Professor McGonagall considered him to have met the requirements. However, for the students who'd lazily carved a few holes in their pumpkins and claimed they'd made jack-o'-lanterns, she wasn't as lenient, assigning them an extended 3-foot essay instead of the standard 1-foot assignment. And those who hadn't managed to meet even the basic requirement didn't escape her displeasure, each faced a similarly stern punishment. That afternoon, herbology class brought an unusual surprise. Professor Sprout set a pot of unfamiliar plants, ones not usually kept in the greenhouse, on the front bench. "Fortified pumpkins," Professor Sprout announced with a smile. "Can anyone tell me what they are?" When no one raised their hand, Professor Sprout's gaze shifted directly to Kyle. Fortified pumpkins, also known as the iron pumpkins, is extremely hard and often used in alchemy, Kyle explained. The vines can also be combined with gillyweed to make a potion that lets people breathe underwater. "Very good, 1 point to Hufflepuff," Professor Sprout said happily. Fortified pumpkins are indeed rare, and because of their hardness, they grow in a very unique way, they shed their skin each time they grow. She pointed to the pot on her desk, where the group noticed a shed pumpkin shell resembling a gauntlet lying beside the plant. Now, does anyone know what this shell is used for? Kyle raised his hand again. People often place these shells on delicate plants to protect them from gnomes and other pests. That's actually where the name, fortified pumpkins, comes from. Precisely right, 10 points to Hufflepuff. Professor Sprout beamed. The shell of the fortified pumpkins provides exceptional protection for fragile plants. In fact, even an adult dragon would have a hard time breaking through it. A hush fell over the greenhouse as the students stared in awe at the unassuming pumpkin shell. Dragons were known as some of the fiercest magical creatures, so learning that even they couldn't bite through this shell underscored just how tough it was. Now, let's get started, Professor Sprout said, clapping her hands to refocus everyone's attention. Additionally, I've decided to award the pumpkin shell as a prize to the student who performs best in today's lesson. Everyone glanced toward Kyle. Judging by his impressive answers so far, it seemed nearly impossible for anyone else to outperform him. But Professor Sprout, reading their thoughts, added with a smile, "Remember, class hasn't officially started yet. What I said was just an introduction and doesn't count toward your performance." With that, she led them over to a nearby row of stakes. Last week, we learned how to fertilize leaping toadstools. Today, we'll be learning how to collect their spores. Remember, leaping toadstools are very sensitive to noise, so you'll need to stay as quiet as possible. The students nodded, silently crouching down beside the stakes and reaching out with paintbrushes to gently collect the spores, each one careful to avoid making a sound. By the end of class, Professor Sprout was visibly pleased. She'd never had such an easy time. No one prodded the plants, no one messed with the venomous tentacula, and everyone seemed serious and focused, eager to win the prize. Today may be the best Halloween yet, she declared, awarding each house 2 extra points. As promised, she handed the shell of the fortified pumpkin to Kyle, who had finished half a class early by using a carefully controlled mini-cyclone to collect his spores. As the students left the greenhouse, Kyle lingered at the door, glancing back one last time at the fortified pumpkin in the corner. He thought it would make a perfect companion for the chomping cabbage, and if possible, he'd love to take some back to add to his collection. But unfortunately, with only one pot and Professor Sprout keeping a close eye on it, he hadn't found a suitable opportunity during class. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 170, Quirrell, Why Haven't You Arrived Yet? Kyle was just about to head back to the dormitory after returning from the greenhouse when he was intercepted by the duo as he stepped into the castle. "Thanks for the book, Kyle," Harry said with a touch of excitement, handing the Origin of Quidditch back to him. "You were right, it's just perfect for me. I've been studying the techniques carefully, and at my last practice, Wood said I'd improved a lot, like I was a whole new player." "You finished reading it so quickly?" Kyle asked, taking the book back with a smile. "No wonder Professor McGonagall thinks so highly of you, Harry, you really are talented." No, I just skimmed it," Harry replied, scratching his head, looking a bit embarrassed. "Maybe it's just because I didn't know much about Quidditch before, so any improvement seems big." "Don't be modest, Harry," Kyle shook his head. "It took me over a month to fully absorb all the techniques in that book, and you managed it in half that time." "Oh, is that so?" Harry's face froze as he gave a strained laugh, his gaze shifting guiltily away from Kyle's. Seeing this, Kyle raised an eyebrow, as if he'd picked up on something. "Do you need any other books?" Kyle offered. "I've got Quidditch Through the Ages and Quidditch, How to Score More Points. I can bring them to the Great Hall if you want." "No, that's all right." Harry blurted out, then quickly added, "I mean, with homework and training, I'm just too busy right now, not much time for reading." "All right, just let me know if you change your mind," Kyle nodded, likely guessing what was really going on. If he was right, Harry probably hadn't even finished the Origin of Quidditch, likely only making it halfway through at best. But that was perfectly normal. Picturing Harry Potter actually sitting down and reading a book in full was almost funny. Still, Seeing the thoughtful look on Kyle's face only made Harry feel guiltier. In truth, Kyle didn't understand Harry as well as he thought. Harry hadn't even made it halfway through the book. When he first started reading, Harry was genuinely interested. The first night, he'd even stayed up until the early hours, falling asleep on the table with the book still open in front of him. But that enthusiasm only lasted a day. Once the initial excitement faded, the long paragraphs and complex vocabulary started to wear on his patience. Around that time, Wood had praised him for his noticeable improvement, saying he was almost on par with Charlie. Figuring he'd done enough, Harry read only about a third of the book before he couldn't bear to continue. Kyle chatted with them a little longer before taking his leave. As he walked away, Ron suddenly turned to Harry. If only Hermione were more like Kyle. What? Harry asked, not following at first. Haven't you noticed? Hermione talks to everyone like she's giving a lecture. It drives people crazy. Honestly, she's like a nightmare sometimes, Ron said. Kyle's nothing like that. He's top of the year, won that special award for services to the school, and yet, he's always patient with us. Whether he's showing us around before term started or lending you a Quidditch book, he doesn't lecture us. Don't say that, Ron, Harry whispered. Hermione can be nice sometimes. Oh really? When? Ron asked, dubious. Harry hesitated, then murmured, well, the other day when Filch was chasing us, she was the one who opened that door at the end of the corridor so we could escape. Yes, and led us straight to the three-headed dog for dinner, Ron replied with a shudder, the memory sending chills down his spine. I'd have rather faced Filch any day. Harry fell silent, privately agreeing. While Filch was terrifying, at least he wasn't likely to eat them like snacks. The Halloween feast is about to start, so let's head to the Great Hall, Harry said, eager to change the subject. I heard it's supposed to be as good as the opening feast. Is that true? Even better, Ron replied with a grin. George told me that last Halloween, Dumbledore had the Headless Hunt perform. I wonder who he's invited this year. Maybe it'll be the Weird Sisters, they're super popular. Harry perked up at this. He'd never heard of the Weird Sisters, but he understood what a band was. Growing up with the Dursleys, he'd never been to a concert, or even watched one on TV. Dudley didn't like music much. The two made their way downstairs to the Great Hall, eager for the feast. Meanwhile, Kyle passed through the barrels in the kitchen corridor and entered the Hufflepuff common room. Only a few students were still there, heading out to the hall as he arrived. One of them noticed him. Kyle. You coming to the feast? I'd like to, but I've got to grab something from the dormitory first, Kyle replied. You go on ahead, I'll be there in a minute. Alright, but you'd better hurry, said an older student. The Halloween feast is about to start. Don't worry, I've been looking forward to the food all day. But despite his words, Kyle had no intention of going to the feast tonight. He had something more pressing to attend to. Once the common room was empty, he settled on a sofa and pulled out a large piece of parchment. It was the Marauder's map, borrowed from Fred and George before herbology that day. I solemnly swear I am up to no good, Kyle recited, and lines of ink spread across the parchment, forming the layout of the castle. As he studied it, he noted that almost everyone was either in the Great Hall or headed there. Only a handful remained scattered around. He scanned the map carefully but didn't see Quirrell's name. A few minutes later, the feast had officially begun. Aside from himself, the only people who hadn't gone to the Great Hall were Hermione, who was still on the first floor, and Filch, who was on the 8th. Still no sign. Kyle frowned, puzzled. Could it be that Quirrell wasn't planning anything tonight? No, that didn't seem right. Kyle quickly dismissed the thought. The feast had only just begun, perhaps it was still too early to see any suspicious movements. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.